Greetings, everyone. This is Caroline Staten with Transition US, and I want to welcome everyone on our call today, and particularly our guest, Rob Hopkins. Rob is the co-founder of TransitionTown.net and of the Transition Network, and it grew out of many years of experience in teaching permaculture, natural building, and setting up the first 2-year permaculture course in the world at Kinsale in Ireland. And he also coordinated some of the first eco-village developments in Ireland as well. He is author of the Transition Handbook, From Oil Dependence to Local Resilience, which got a lot of us involved early on. It's been published in a number of languages and voted 5th most popular book taken on holidays by MPs during the summer of 2008. More recently, the Transition Companion is another book that he's published, The Transition Companion, Making Your Community More Resilient in Uncertain Times. That's available through, both those books are available here in the U.S. through Chelsea Green Publishers. He publishes the blog transitionculture.org, recently voted the 4th best green blog in the UK. He tweets as Rob in Transition, and recently came 11th in the Peer Index Driven Sustainability Drivers list, which I don't know what that is, Rob, but I hope you'll mention that as well. He was the winner of the 2008 Schumacher Award. He's an Ashoka Fellow, Fellow of the Post-Carbon Institute, and has received the Observer Ethical Award for Grassroots Campaigner in the Grassroots Campaigners category. Oh my gosh, there's just so many accolades for you. In December, voted the Energy Saving Trust Guardian's Green Community Hero Award. And in February 2012, Rob and the Transition Network were among Nesta and the Observer's list of Britain's 50 New Radicals. One of the paragraphs that I love from your bio, Rob, it's Rob Hopkins brings humor, imagination, and vision to the great challenges of our time and argues that what is needed above all else at this time in history is engaged optimism. The rapidly spreading transition movement, which he was pivotal in establishing, is an embodiment of that. Nicholas Crane, presenter of BBC Two's recent Town series, recently referred to transition as the biggest urban brainwave of the century. So without further ado, Rob, I'm going to turn it over to you, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you very much, and hello everybody. What a delight to be here. Thank you very much. And if you've taken a break at lunchtime to come and listen to this, I'm very flattered that you've done so. And so there was 2% of people who had absolutely no idea what transition is all about. So that might be a good place to start, I think. So transition, I think, for me is really about what a bottom-up response to peak oil, climate change, end of economic growth look like, but seeing that as an opportunity. And I increasingly think of it as being about community resilience as economic development. That at the moment, when all the other ideas for how we heal an economy and work at that local level seem to really have run out, actually what transition is increasingly starting to model is, I think, a new big idea. And I'll come on to that in a minute. But first thing was, so Caroline sent me a list of questions, and one of those was about the new book that we're doing, which is going to be coming out in June, which is going to be called The Power of Just Doing Stuff. And it's designed to be a sort of an introduction to these ideas for people who aren't already involved in transition. And one of the things that's really central to that is, as I say, the idea of the big idea, which I suppose is really that there are the things that we can do ourselves as individuals, as families, the things that go on in our own home in terms of insulation and growing potatoes and growing salads on the windowsills and driving less, all that kind of stuff. And then there's all the stuff that government is meant to do on our behalf. But in between those two, there's a big space, a bit in the middle, which is about what we can do if we can get together with other people on our streets, on our neighborhoods, in our towns, and what we can actually create on that scale. Because as the power of just doing stuff suggests, I think there is an enormous untapped power and energy there if we can get that right. And what that does is it starts to unlock the other ones. It starts to unlock the kind of government inaction, the business inaction, the local government inaction. It starts to kind of change the narrative and change the story. And I think we have an enormous freedom at that local level to talk about things and ask questions which just aren't being asked in other places. I had a really interesting experience when about 6 months ago I went to speak at an event that was organised near here, which was all the chief executive officers of all the local councils in this part of the UK, the southwest, and they all came together for 2 days to sort of meet each other and hear inspiring stories from each other and moan about how things are for them, I guess, as well in the bar afterwards. And we were facilitating that. And at the beginning, we went round and we asked them their name and where they were from and stuff. And then the throwaway question was, and what's your sense of where we're heading economically? Where do you think we'll be in 5 years' time? I was expecting them all to say, well, we'll all be back to growth, 2%, 3% within 5 years, because publicly that's what they'd all be saying. Actually, when we went round, one of them said, every generation up until now has had more than the one before. This is where that ends. One guy said, this is what the end of Western civilization looks like. One person started talking about how he was reading a history book about Roman Britain in 308 AD, when they had roads and agriculture and so on and so on. And within 20 years, they were back in the Iron Age. He said the same thing could happen again. But what was fascinating about that was that in public, that's not what's being said in public. But when you get a lot of those people on their own, actually they don't believe it. It's like the emperor's new clothes. So I think that the work that Transition is doing about exploring what a post-growth economy might look like in practice is absolutely central and absolutely important. And it started, as Caroline said, in Ireland and in Devon, in Totnes, but is now active in about 40 countries. I think there's about 2,500 transition initiatives that we know about, but we know that there are lots more that we don't. So, for example, in Sweden, I think there are about 5 registered official ones, but there's about 171 on the Ning site. So it's something that's really sort of gone viral in that way and gone off all over the place. So what I do in the new book really is to look at it in the context of what the new normal, what's the new economic normal, the new climate normal, the new energy normal. And one of the questions that somebody sent in was, well, can we really even talk about peak oil anymore? Because in the US at least there's this sense that actually we're absolutely awash with cheap gas and cheap oil due to fracking and so on. I mean, that's certainly not the case outside the US. It's certainly not the case here in the UK, so we still very much use that as an issue. I think there's a very good study that Post Carbon Institute did recently about the shale gas revolution. But it's really, I think, arguing that actually it's not something that's going to last very long and actually leaves people in a worse state by the end of it. But it depends on the place. So in Brazil, where as far as they're concerned they are the new Saudi Arabia, there's not really much point talking about peak oil there. And they talk more about social justice and social enterprise and that kind of thing. So it's very kind of place specific, I suppose. But fundamentally it's about resilience. It's about how can the place where you live be more resilient to shock from the outside. And I started out thinking about resilience as being about how it's described in the more, in most of the books about it, that it's about how do you design in the ability to withstand shock from the outside, that kind of stuff. But increasingly, actually, I feel like resilience is about the degree of possibility that you manage to breathe into a local culture in advance of rapid change happening, so that when you encounter that kind of change, you feel that you have possibilities, you feel that you have options at your disposal. So in the book, I started out with looking at some of the smaller things that people do, because I'll come on to talk about some of the bigger things that are happening in terms of transition. But I think it's really important to note that actually a lot of the really interesting things that happen in transition, you may be involved in a project that you may feel is really small and so therefore kind of fairly inconsequential. But actually, a lot of those small projects are really, really important in terms of people coming together, people developing the confidence that they can do something, people starting to see change happening around them. And one of the ones in the book is from a place called Porto Alegre in Portugal. So in Portugal, the economic crisis is really, really terrible at the moment. The average salary is about 450 euros a month, which isn't very much, and supermarket prices are the same as they are in the UK, and lots of people are really, really suffering. And so in Porto Alegre, and there's all kinds of stuff going on with transition. They have a different model there because they can't, if they put on a film and charge $3 or $4 for people to come and see the film, not many people will come because that kind of disposable money just isn't around. So they do a lot of what they do as a gift economy. So I talked to a woman there called Sonia Tavares, and she talked about that she lives in an apartment block. And the apartment block, on the other side of the road is a sort of a shopping mall, and then there's a small grassy area in front of, to the side of the shopping mall. And a group of people from Transition started working with some people in the apartment block to see about turning that piece of ground into a food garden. And all of a sudden on the day, most of the people who lived in the building came out and they dug this place over and they turned it into a food garden. Now this isn't going to be a food garden that's going to do much to dent Porto Alegre's food security, but it's very visible, very public, right next to the shopping centre. And so Sonia said to me, "It's amazing. I've been living in Porto Alegre forever, 37 years, and I felt my community and my city crumble, people turning their backs to each other. This community garden we created tells me it's possible to do things with other people. It is possible. We just need to wake each other up again." And that garden has sort of led to all kinds of other different things. One of the neighbours said, we were living in this block and did not know our neighbours. We had nothing to tell each other. Now in the morning we have a smile to share. We talk about the plants, how they're doing, and whether we will meet downstairs this evening. In Deepening in London, which is one of the transition groups in London, and one of the questions that somebody sent in was about how do you do transition in a city? Well, the experience in London is that it works best on the neighbourhood scale. You start at the scale of the neighbourhood. And from that, that's really the best sort of scale to be doing things that are really going to have an impact. So there are now about 50 transition groups across London, but they work at that local level. There is no Transition London as one extremely overstretched organisation trying to transition this enormous city. You break it off into kind of bite-sized, manageable pieces. And Transition Town Tooting has done all kinds of really interesting things. One of the most recent things they did was called the Tooting Transition Shop, which is a shop that opened in an empty shop on the high street for 9 days. And they called it the shop with nothing for sale but lots on offer. And they invited people to drop into the shop and tell them about what it was like to live in Tooting now and to imagine different futures for the place. And people left all kinds of different stories and anecdotes and things that they'd made. And about 800 people came back during the 9 days and visited the shop. And I asked Lucy Neal, who was the person who had organised it, what was the moment for her when the hair stood up on the back of her neck. And she said that on the last night they did a performance called Tooting Stories, which was, she said, a sincere, moving, honest and magical thing that wove everyone's stories together like honey gathered from a hive. It made me see how very capable we are of creating the world we long for. What if every high street had a shop like this? And a story that's a bit closer to home for you guys, which I really like, is the story about the tool library in northeast Seattle, where the transition group there, Sustainable Northeast Seattle, gathered about 1,200 tools donated by local people, got a space offered by the local church, and set up what they called a community-led project to provide pay-what-you-can community access to a wide range of tools, training and advice. and some really lovely stories about how people donated their late parents' tools and so on. And I talked to Susan Gregory there, and she said, to me, it's almost like magic. It's like things just started happening and people just showed up, and it seemed really easy. Mostly I've just felt as though it's happening of its own accord almost. It's been, like I say, magic almost. I can't believe this is really here. We're here and it's happening. And when I was researching the book, I did a lot of talking to people in different places, and that sense of tapping into something really thrilling came through from lots and lots of people. The sense of the kind of creativity and the positivity that is unleashed through a process like this is really, really exciting. And in Totnes, we're the first, I suppose, or arguably the second transition initiative. We've been going for about 7 years now. So I thought it might be good just to give you a little taste of some of the things that are underway here that I think are really exciting developments. So we've kicked off about 40 different projects since we've started here. Probably brought about £1 million into Totnes in terms of funding from different places, and we've got to the stage now where, so quite often people come to Totnes, and some of you may have come here, and you think, you imagine you're going to come and visit some sort of transition Shangri-La. But actually, sometimes people say, well, you've still got cars, I'm very disappointed, and well, what can I see? And a lot of, I think, what goes on here runs sort of under the surface, but we're getting closer to the things that are the really solid visual things that you can see when you visit. So Transition Homes, which is a project seeking to build 25 affordable houses built predominantly out of local materials, now has a site and is moving forward towards submitting its planning application. And we're just about to publish. It'll be coming out next week, and you'll be able to read about it on Transition Culture next Wednesday. We're publishing something which is called an economic blueprint, which I think is really exciting and marks a real kind of leap forward in transition, actually, because what happens usually, if Walmart want to come into my town and open a big supermarket and displace lots of independent businesses and reduce the resilience of that economy, they're able to say, we will bring in, we will create 30 jobs and put £1 million into the local economy every year. Those of us who argue for transition and for a local economy, and that the local economy is a more sensible way to go, we aren't really able to do that. We tend to have to say, well, it's a better idea because it's more sustainable and it's more resilient and that kind of thing. We've never really had the economic case to back it up that those people who are so rapidly driving us in the other direction seem to always have at their fingertips. So the idea of an economic blueprint is that it's a very, very detailed mapping of the local economy, so that for the first time we're really able to see where all the money goes. And it's an attempt, I suppose, to be able to identify the size of the prize, if you like, of localizing. So the Totnes one looks at food, energy, retrofitting our houses, and care for the elderly. And it argues that, for example, it identifies, for example, that every year Totnes spends about £30 million on food, of which 20 million goes out through just 2 supermarkets, 17 million of that through just 1 supermarket. So already, you can see that we have a much stronger local food sector than many other people, many other places. But it means that we can also identify that there is a potential £20 million there that could actually be coming into this economy. If we're able to shift 10% collectively what we spend on food to supporting local food businesses, that's £2 million a year into this economy, which could be used to create businesses, retraining, all kinds of things, which at the moment just slips through our fingertips like sand every year. When you add in renewable energy and all these things, then actually we've identified that there is a potential £5 million every year that could be coming into this town, or rather that could be staying in this town. With that kind of information, with that kind of case set out so beautifully as it will be in the economic blueprint, transition moves from being an idea to being a form of economic development. And at this time in history, we need a different model. And actually, I think transition or community economic development, as it's being increasingly called, really is that big idea, that new story that we really, really need. Another thing that's happening here is something called the Atmos Project. And I've argued for quite a long time that alongside relocalizing food and currencies and so on, we also really need to be looking at how our community can own its own assets. And development and regeneration is so often something which is done to a community. External developers will come in and build something horrible that we then all have to live with, and all the profit goes off to big investment houses somewhere else. Well, if we can become our own developer and we can own assets, that's really important. And that could be a real key driver of this. And we started a project in Totnes about 6 years ago when a big milk processing plant next to the railway station closed down, and we called it the Atmos Project due to the building being on the site that was part of a historic experimental atmospheric railway system. And we spent 6 years trying to persuade the site's owners to allow the community to develop the site and to bring it into community ownership. For the last 6 months of it, we ran a big campaign with some very high-profile patrons and with lots of online activity and blogs and media coverage, that kind of thing. And then about 3 weeks ago, we found out that actually we can now go ahead and the campaign has been successful, and that we can start to design and develop this site as what we call the heart of a new economy. That this can be a place where we can showcase a development designed to kickstart this kind of economy and to bring this stuff into community ownership. We want to apply the same thinking we apply to local food, where we say if you eat local food, you create more work locally, there's less food miles, it's healthier, that kind of stuff. Apply that to local building materials and seek to build, using 80-90% local building materials, with the idea that that is something that will then start to stimulate all kinds of new business and training opportunities as well. So we're really thrilled about this. It's been something we've put a lot of work into for a long time, and it's great that we've got there. I think the other thing, building from that, is that we've really tried to shift our work here from being just about peak oil and climate change to being about how do we create that new economy where we live. How do we shift the culture? And a few people asked about, and I'll come talk a bit more about it in a minute, but how do you sustain momentum in a transition group? And our experience in Totnes was, we spent the first 2 or 3 years just talking about peak oil and climate change and what we were going to do about it and so on. And lots of people got involved and lots of things happened, but it felt like it was the same people coming after a while. Once we started to shift the narrative to talking about social enterprise, to talking about new economic model, to talking about identifying ways of internal investment, which again I'll talk about more in a minute, then a whole load of other people started coming along who were almost sort of waiting for us to make that shift somehow. And that's brought a whole lot of new kind of energy and momentum into the whole process. And one of the manifestations of that is what we call the Local Entrepreneurs Forum, which happens once a year and which will be happening next week, which is a day's event where we invite people who have ideas for new businesses, for new enterprises, to come along to the day, and we also invite people who have skills around business, sort of mentoring experience, and people who are potential investors, whether it's just a few £100 or tens of thousands of pounds, who would like to invest that in some kind of local businesses. And we bring them together in a way where they kind of cross-pollinate with each other and meet with each other and share that experience. And last year's one was fantastic. It ended with a big green dragon's den, and quite a few people met with investors and made those kind of connections. So it feels like actually once we've taken that step over into saying, okay, we want to create a new economy, no one else is going to do that for us, we need to drive that, then it brings up all kinds of creativity and ideas and inspiration, and it's really exciting to see that happening. I wanted to just share a few stories from other places of big projects that seem to be happening that kind of give a taste of maybe where all this can go. And as part of that, I suppose, to just distinguish between what we might call extractive investment, inward investment, and internal investment. So extractive investment is sort of distant absentee landlords who own buildings in our town that they just don't really care about what happens in their town. They're just extracting money out. Or big supermarkets who site themselves in our communities in order to suck that money out of the place where we live. Inward investment is money that comes in through government or through private businesses in order to try and make things happen in the place where we live, and that might be really good in terms of stimulating new enterprises that increase the resilience of where we live, or it could also be inward investment to do regeneration, which actually just clears away all the independent businesses and creates a space which is just for chain businesses. Or then there's internal investment. And internal investment, I think, is really, really important. And it's the work that Bally and people have been pioneering in the US for some time, about getting communities to invest inward into themselves through community shares, the acquisition of assets into community ownership, community energy companies, that kind of thing. And the first story I was going to tell you about is about in Bath, the city of Bath. So Bath and West Community Energy is a community-owned energy company set up about 3 years ago. And their idea was to get the community to invest inwards to make that happen. But they're an interesting combination of inward and internal investment. So one of the big energy companies who wants to do innovative things around working with communities invested £1 million in them to get them started. And what that meant was that they were able to do a different model. So from day one, they were able to offer people a return on their investment. Quite a few community energy companies will say, please invest in us, and at some point in the future, we will really hope that we are able to give you some kind of a return. Bath and West Community Energy said from day one, invest in us, and you'll get 6%, 6 point something or other percent every year on your investment. What that meant was that then people felt confident enough to shift their pensions, shift their savings into a community-owned energy company. And when you're able to do that, the whole story starts to change. They raised £750,000, £750,000, over about a month and a half, and are now doing all kinds of stuff, installing renewables across the city. And when I talked to Peter Capener, who was one of the founders, he said, every time I cycle into Bristol, I go past one of the schools that has the solar systems on it. Every time I go past, I look at it and think, I was involved in getting that up there. That makes it worthwhile, really. Generating that sense of we can do something, and actually seeing that happening on the ground or begin to happen is something that makes the hairs stand up for me. In the city of Bristol is the Bristol pound, which is a really fantastic local currency system. And it's also, for me, I think, is a really interesting example of how you never know the power of what you're doing and the stories of what you're creating. So in about 2007, I walked into a building here in Totnes that used to be the old bank, and I saw on the wall a framed 1810 banknote from Totnes, and it just started a question: what would happen if we printed some more? Are you allowed to do that? What happens if you do that? And then we thought, well, let's just do it and see. And we printed 300 and gave them away to people at an event. And then that led on to the evolution of the Totnes pound here, which led on to the evolution of other places, Lewis and Stroud and Brixton, inspired by things like Berkshires and some of the currencies, local currencies from the US. And then that led on to Brixton, and then Brixton developed a whole way of where you can pay by phone, pay by text for your shopping. And then the city of Bristol, of 800,000 people, recently launched the Bristol Pound. And what's exciting about the Bristol Pound is that it has the full support of the City Council. So you can pay your taxes in Bristol Pounds. You can pay your business rates in Bristol Pounds. The City Council pays its staff who would like it. They can be paid a percentage of their salary in Bristol Pounds. And when they recently elected a mayor for the first time, just before Christmas, George Ferguson, in his inauguration speech, he announced that he would be taking his full salary of £51,000 in Bristol Pounds. And then a couple of weeks later, when the Queen visited, she was presented with a gift pack, a presentation pack of Bristol pounds. And history does not record whether she was a bit disappointed that her head wasn't on it. And I sort of have this mental picture that somewhere in the Tower of London there is a special dungeon reserved for people who print their own money. But anyway, so that scheme has been going really fantastically, and the software that was developed for the pay-by-text system is open source and can be used by anyone, and there's many hundreds of businesses now taking the Bristol pound. Another project that's very exciting, I think, is Brixton Energy, and I visited Brixton a little while ago in London. And Brixton Energy is a project that grew out of Transition Brixton, and it's a community-owned energy company, but it's in a very in a part of London which has very high levels of deprivation, and their aim was to put solar PV on the roof of some of the poorest housing blocks in that part of London. And so the first share launch that they did, they raised about £100,000 from local people, but they were mostly from the more kind of white middle class people in that part of London who thought things like that were a good idea. And the solar was installed on the roof of this big tower block, and all went very well. So then when they did the second one, what they found was that about 50% of the money actually came from the people in the buildings themselves, which was really their aim. They trained local people to install them. They worked with people in the building, and a lot of people moved the money out of their bank and into their own community energy company. And then what they were sure of when I went there was that they were about to do the third share launch on a local on another local tower block, and they were very convinced that actually what would happen was that the people that they would be able to do that 100% from people who lived in the tower block, because the word was going around between everybody that actually this was a really great thing to get behind. And it was a really, really exciting project. And the guy who I spoke to there, who was running it, a guy called Agamemnon Otero, he said, ultimately what we're really about is trying to change minds on the ground and to make people warmer. Energy, solar panels or whatever are just a way to get there. We're not wedded to solar panels or combined heat and power or whatever. We're wedded to well-being. The only way people ever believe in themselves and get involved is when they're allowed to be involved. As soon as you take responsibility for something and you give and you take back and you give and you take back, you develop self-will and self-belief, and that's what's been taken away from people. Again and again I see that the best way to get people involved is to allow them to take back a part of their own autonomy. So this step of saying, well, how do we see what we're doing as being like a social enterprise is a big step culturally, I think, for transition. And very often those of us who get involved often have come from a background of almost recoiling at the very idea. And so one of the things that Transition Network has set up recently is the Re-Economy Project, which is about offering support and inspiration and tools and resources for people who want to turn what they're doing into social enterprises and starting to tell those stories. And I'm not sure how much of that has made across to the US yet, but there's some very exciting tools, and that would be a really good area to explore, I think. And I was really taken a while ago with the story of Don Hall in Transition Sarasota there, where they had actually started. I remember at the Transition Network conference a few years ago, there was a discussion about what would it look like if you designed the awareness raising stage of your transition group as a social enterprise. And it was just sort of kicked around as an idea, really, I suppose. But when I talked to Don there, and he was talking about how that initiative was sort of one of the founding ideas was that they wanted to be able to, from day one, be able to pay Don for the work that he's doing, so they could have somebody working full time on it, which for some involved in transition might feel like a sort of like a heresy, but actually I think it's a really, really interesting idea that if we're trying to create the kind of change on the scale that we need to create, and we're trying to create this kind of new local economy, just doing it on every other Wednesday evening probably isn't enough. And if we can enable somebody to really give it that kind of push then maybe that's more skillful and maybe that's more effective. So a question that came up a lot in the questions people sent in was about, as I said before, about momentum and how do we actually do that. So for me, as I said, one of the ways that I see that momentum comes is from stepping up the local projects so that people can really see what's going on. And that idea, you read a lot of the time this idea of impact investing. What does impact investing mean? Well, I think for me that ultimately transition is one of the best forms of impact investing, because you can actually see that impact as you walk around. You can see the place around you changing as you move around in it. But in the transition training, they've recently developed this training called Thrive, which is designed for groups who are a couple of years in and who, has come through in some of the questions, who feel that sort of momentum has flagged a little bit. And they've identified a few things which feel like, they call it the dognostic. It's like, you imagine it's a dog and it has 4 legs and a tail and a head and so on. And that you have to have all of those things in order for it to work. And it's a very useful tool through which to look at your own initiative and get a sense of maybe the areas that could do with a bit more kind of support. So the first one is awareness raising. That awareness raising work needs to be kind of ongoing through the initiative rather than just something you do at the beginning and then assume that you've done that. So keeping that awareness raising going is really important. Networks and partnerships that you're building, those networks with other organizations, building that sort of ground of feeling, against other groups feeling part of what you're doing. So the blueprint that I mentioned earlier on for Totnes, I think one of the most exciting things about that is that it's not just the work of Transition Town Totnes. It is the work of the Town Council, the Chamber of Commerce. It has input and support from the District Council. It has the local schools, the local colleges. It's a real kind of coalition, and that strength has come from those networks and partnerships. The third one is practical projects, is that you actually get things going on the ground, things that are kind of visible, things you can tell stories about, things that people can get involved in, things where people can see the world around them starting to change. So if you're just awareness raising but nothing is actually happening on the ground, then people are going to lose interest relatively quickly and wander off. And then the last thing is the group, the organization. So there's the aspect in terms of a lot of the work that comes through in the transition training and in the inner transition stuff about making sure that that group is working properly, that the meetings are well facilitated, that there is support for people, that people feel held, and that those the sort of facilitation things happen really well and really effectively. But also in terms of designing an organization around it which actually works and which is clear what's going on in that organization. So sometimes people assume somehow that transition in Totnes, for example, happened by magic. I mean, actually what happened was that a few of us gave a lot of time and energy to get it set up, but that was able to happen because the processes were good and the group was able to support each other. We have a very useful thing here. There were a lot of questions about inner transition. I mean, one of the things that for me is one of the best manifestations of inner transition here is the mentoring scheme that we have. So anybody who is actively involved in the heart of Transition Town Totnes is able to get support from trained mentors, counsellors, therapists, or whatever. And you can go along and then you have that confidential space and that kind of support, and it's made an enormous difference in terms of levels of burnout, levels of exhaustion, trying to get away from that conventional activist model of must keep going for sake of planet, and burning out and then kind of crawling back up again and staggering on a bit further and then collapsing again and feeling burnt out and exhausted and fed up with the whole thing. Actually designing in that sort of support and nurturing is really, really important, I think. So those would be those are the 4 kind of legs, if you like, and it's useful to look at your initiative and to see whether those 4 things are there: the awareness raising, the network and partnerships, the practical projects, and paying attention to the group and the organisation. And it can be very useful to a way of identifying where you might be able to put some attention. And then, of course, it has to have vision. You have to be looking forward and seeing where you're going and what's happening, and paying attention to the personal resilience, the heart of the whole process, and designing in time to celebrate. And one of the things that I've seen in a few initiatives where people have, where it feels like momentum is going, is to invite people to come and celebrate what's been created so far. And a while ago I went to a place in Italy called Ferrara, which has a great transition project going on there. And they did this really nice exercise where they had this long length of washing line string, brightly coloured string. And onto this string they had clipped loads of different cards. And the cards basically captured all of the things that transition group had done since it started in 2009. So for each thing there would be a photograph and just a few words, little write-up about what it was. And they had a box with this in, and they started out just passing this string around the room, and it went through the 2009 events and then the 2010 events, 11, 2012, 2013, and this string went on and on and on, and it triggered people saying, "Oh look, I'd forgotten about that. Oh wow, do you remember that?" And when you saw this thing had gone all the way around the room, around all these people, like a snake all around the room between everybody, it was amazing to see how kind of regenerating that was to people. When you're in the middle of it and just going for it, you can often lose a sense of the perspective of what you've done and what you've achieved. So I've talked for quite long enough, I'm sure, especially to just be sitting there listening to a disembodied voice coming out of a computer. Just the last couple of things, I suppose. So the power of just doing stuff will hopefully be coming out in June. And we're also creating a new version of the primer. So some of those of you who were around quite early on in transition will know we had something that was called the Transition Primer, that was a free PDF download that was a sort of how to get started doing transition, but it kind of went out of date quite quickly. So we're doing a new version of that, and sort of rejigging the website and so on. And yeah, I think that's about all I had to say really. So I'm going to hand back to Caroline, and we can move on to some questions.
Hi, Rob. Thank you. Seems like we could hear from you for another few hours. I'm sure you could just roll on with so much wonderful information. But let's go to a few questions. I know you covered a lot of the questions in what you've talked about so far. One thing that might be of interest in the U.S., many communities are up against sort of fracking. And I know at the Transition Network Conference in September, there was a breakout group about sort of transition efforts and political activism. And just wonder if you might mention anything about that, any thoughts on that, anything that in your experience sort of about that activism side and transition.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, I suppose there are many ghastly things that are going on, and gas fracking is a very clear one of those. And gas here in the UK, we're just at the stage of gas fracking starting up, and so we've a lot to learn from your experience there of having had it going on there for quite some time. One of the dangers that's happening here is that our politicians are looking to the US and the supposed shale gas miracle and going, oh, can we have one of those too, please? Never mind the fact that actually here we have very, very different shale and a very, very different geography, and so on and so on. It's one of those things which is this sort of delusional, we must keep economic growth going at all costs. How are we going to do that? Oh, that's the last bit of energy or whatever, the last fossil fuels. So, but in terms of transition and activism, my sense is that generally we are more skillful if we can put an activist hat on and do that and not call it transition, and then keep the transition stuff as something that we do without our activism hat on. The workshop that Caroline referred to was one about what happens when transition initiatives say no. When they see something they identify as being a big threat to local resilience. So here in Totnes, we had a big campaign a while ago to try and stop a big coffee chain opening in a town where we already have about 40 independent coffee businesses, or independent places where you can buy coffee. And we had a big national chain who wanted to come in and open a branch in spite of lots of opposition. And ultimately it was actually a campaign that was successful, but it was a very difficult thing for a transition group who have a sort of declared position of not being adversarial and not being against things, to take that kind of a position. And I think, and it has been very difficult, and actually, although it felt we had to do it, and I would still argue we did have to do it, I think it actually was, it created a lot of difficulties, or a lot of sort of blowback, I think, as a group. So it's something to be done with great caution, I think. Whereas it might be more skillfully to have done that if it was a lot of the same people, but that didn't have an explicit link to transition. Because one of the things that's really important for transition, I think, is that it is seen as being not political and not allied to the left or to the right or to the centre or whatever. And so something like the economic blueprint here in Totnes couldn't have happened if we were explicitly linked to the left or the right politically. At the local level, you need those kind of coalitions and so on, and that makes a big difference.
Great, thank you for that. I also have a few questions about diversity, and we have one of our transition trainers, Steve Chase, sitting in a classroom with a room of students, and they have a question on diversity, justice, and inclusion. And they'd love to hear you, Rob, share any experiences from around the world of initiatives addressing issues of class, race, cultural diversity, and becoming more inclusive and effective as a result. So that would be great to hear from you on that. And there were a few other people that had questions on making materials more accessible, if there's any concerted effort to do that, or any concerted efforts to roadmaps or information to help broaden it and include everybody. So over to you.
Yeah, that's the $60 million question, isn't it? I suppose, and we did produce on the Transition Network website. You'll find a kind of a diversity primer or a little guide that we did for transition groups who want to think about those issues more. In terms of some examples, I think one of my favourite examples is in Tooting in London, which is a very, very diverse part of London. And if you, in a lot of places in more sort of towns and cities, the idea of local food is something you can kind of relate to. Local food is, stuff that's kind of seasonal and is used in sort of the dishes that we maybe grew up with or whatever. In that part of London, when you walk down the high street, most food shops that you go into, every single thing in that shop is imported from the Indian subcontinent. Everything. And so what does local food mean in that context? So they run an event that happens every year they call the Foodival. And what happens with the Foodival is that people all around that part of the city grow local food on their allotments, on their back gardens, or whatever, on their balconies, and they bring that food down to the high street one Saturday in September. And then the cooks from the different restaurants, Lebanese, Turkish, Pakistani, Indian restaurants, then cook that local food in their tradition. And then that food is given away on the high street to people walking past. And they do other kind of events around that too. I think it's really important that when you're running a transition project, you don't run it on the basis that people will come to you. And my experience of being in the environmental movement for a long time is that there was sometimes that sense that one day everybody will realize how right we've been all the time, and we just need to sort of wait until they'll actually come along and to finally realize, or finally wake up. You hear that terribly condescending term when people wake up, banded around quite a bit. I think in transition it's really important to be continually asking who isn't here that should be here, and then going to find those people. A friend of mine who did a lot of diversity work in transition said that she went to visit this one group who she said, they said, well, we're often talked about as being hard to reach groups. They said, well, we meet here every Tuesday afternoon. So it's also, I think, really important that in transition groups we develop a mindfulness about the language that we use and how we present what we do. And in terms of materials, well, I'm currently doing this primer, and I'm trying very much to have that in mind and to write something that feels really accessible. And we'll have a kind of a sounding board for that of people from a range of different settings in terms of the language that we use and how accessible that feels. But like all of transition, this is an experiment. And so, I'm sure there are lots of people out there who have experience of what they've done to bring that sense of diversity and inclusion into what they're doing. And maybe we might have some time at the end of this to hear a couple of those.
Great. Yes, we will be able to open it up for some live questions soon, I think. Another question that came up from a few different people is just involving youth, and wondering how transition's getting along in schools or colleges, college students or even younger students being involved in transition, and just any thoughts or comments about younger people being involved in this work.
Yeah, God, this is all the really thorny questions coming out, isn't it, in one go here. This is I go and visit quite a lot of transition projects, and the age profile is very different in lots of different places. I was in Germany a couple of weeks ago. I did a talk in Berlin, in Germany, and there were loads of young people. It was fantastic. And then I'll go to some other places, and there's lots of grey hair nodding sagely in the audience. So it's very different in different places, and I don't quite know why that is. Clearly it's something where we need to find ways for transition to feel really accessible. And I think something like Brixton Energy, when I was there, was very kind of urban and funky, and their design was very sort of contemporary and great, really. So, at the Transition Network conference this year, we had a youth day where young people from all across the country came, and that was really good. And then they were very involved in the rest of the conference. I think it's something where, for each transition initiative, to have a real mindfulness of trying to build that in to what they do and making things accessible and inviting young people to be part of it. But again, I don't think it's definitely one of those things that's an edge, that's an issue, that's still really kind of emergent and being explored. And again, it'd be really interesting to hear other people's experience of that.
Wonderful. I think this will be the last question from the questions that were submitted. Then we'll be able to take a few live ones. This is more about the initiating group or the core group, those sort of first responders that have created the transition initiative, and any comments about succession and how, if you've noticed any particular way or process that passing the baton has worked more effectively than in other places. It'd be wonderful to hear any good succession tips.
Well, I think it's in the Transition Handbook, we had this idea about form a steering group and design its demise from the outset. And I think some people took that very literally and sort of saying, right, we've been going for a year, well, we'd all better just stop now and see what happens. And there were a few places who would organise a big event and say, right, who wants to? They have an unleashing or something, and then they would like a launch event, and then they would say, okay, we're stepping down now. We've set it up. And actually, I think one of the real values that I've seen is in having some people who have that sense of the longevity of the whole thing and know it from the beginning, but they're always kind of creating space and inviting new people to feel part of it. I know here in Tottenham, so I took a very clear decision about 3 years ago to step back from being on the steering group and being a trustee or whatever, because for that very reason, for those kind of succession sort of issues and questions and founder syndrome and that kind of thing. But yeah, I don't know. I think it's different in every place. I don't think there is a kind of a golden rule with it. I think it's just that it is important to be aware that you need to be bringing new people in all the time, and sometimes it can be good to step aside and let other people come in, and sometimes it's really valuable to hold on and keep that moving. And I suppose sometimes, well, if too many people say, actually, we're going to step back and see what happens, then there aren't enough people to do the initiative. So it's always a bit of a balance.
Thanks for your thoughts on that. And now let's open up we have a few minutes to open up for live questions. And if you have a question that you think others on the call, others in transition groups could relate to, those are the kind of questions for this call that would be most helpful for all of us. So, and if you could also be fairly concise so we could get in a few. Press 1 on your keypad if you have a question for Rob on any transition-related topic. Hey, Jim Loving, go ahead.
Hi, Rob. Thanks for what you're doing. I'm one of the Mullers on the call. I had a question sort of broadly about if you could speak to collaborations with other like-minded groups. Just kind of do a casual read of the drivers for why to have this initiative. There are different blogs and organizations. I think I saw where Transition was involved with Smart CSOs of the UK. Got on Elkington's group talking about capitalism, the same CEO group you were talking about. But there are a number of disparate initiatives that are trying to build local resilience, and I didn't know if Transition has an intentional collaboration strategy. So that's my question.
Do you mean transition as in initiatives or transition network?
Well, I mean other organizations that are unique or separate from transition that are essentially duplicating the intent, which is to build resilience in communities, whether that be peak prosperity with Martinson, or whether it be the preppers that you hear about in the U.S., or whether you hear about corporations that have civic-minded initiatives that are recognizing, as you said in Candid Moments, the need to change, whether it's Elkington's breakthrough capitalism, or there's strategic intent to collaborate more directly.
I mean, absolutely. There's no point in reinventing the wheel, and in lots of cases, actually, we're much more effective if we're able to work with other people. I guess transition network and initiatives here would tend to team up with other organizations around particular projects or particular initiatives. So the blueprint I just mentioned has been a coming together with all kinds of different organizations locally here and a couple of national organizations to work on that project. And there would certainly be, Transition Network is part of a national coalition about community renewable energy, and with New Economics Foundation working with us on the Reconomy project. So absolutely, there's lots of ways in which we would overlap with other organizations, and I think that for local initiatives as well, creating those kind of link-ups can be really, really effective. I think any time you go into something like that, it's really important to be clear about what your expectations and what their expectations are, because sometimes you can find yourself in those kind of situations and it can all go a bit pear-shaped and create a lot of bad feeling because people are all expecting to get different things out of it. But I think as a principle, creating those kind of coalitions and those kind of partnerships are vital, absolutely.
Thank you, Rob, for that. I was reminded of another question from the questions that were received about partnerships with permaculture educators and groups. I'm wondering if you've seen that flourish, and where and how.
Yeah, there's quite a few transition groups who would run permaculture training. There's quite a lot of the time it's people who have a background in permaculture who tend to be the people who understand the sort of thinking behind transition first. Certainly Transition Network here has done bits of work with the Permaculture Association here as well. So that is a kind of a natural partnership, I think. And yeah, like I say, I think at the local level, a lot of transition groups will put on some sort of permaculture training or some permaculture-related events too. And then when they start to get into sort of more meaty projects like the Transition Homes project I talked about here, they're taking a permaculture approach to how the site is designed, and they've run trainings and so on in order to make that happen.
Great, that sounds exciting. Thank you. Wanted to move to Kathy Ehlers, I believe. I might be saying your name wrong. Kathy, are you with us? Maybe unmuting yourself?
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I just wanted to ask how local transitions groups can incubate more female leadership. The Syracuse Cultural Workers Peace Calendar for this month says, I'll be post-feminist in the post-patriarchy. And I think many women kind of sit in the background stewing, thinking that male leadership of the world has gotten us into the mess we're in, and that it would be nice to see a female-led organizational effort. And I just was curious how that might happen.
Yeah, I think, certainly my experience of transition groups that I visit is that actually in terms of the gender balance of people who are involved, that tends to be very good. And a lot of the time, the people who are really the ones who are paying attention to the process side of it and to the kind of the sort of more sort of emotional inner aspect of the group and how it functions tend to be the women, and the engagement obviously in the different groups tends to vary. Often it's in some energy groups tend to be more male-led, and education groups and so on. There's much more balanced. I think there is still sometimes. Certainly when we run a transition conference every year, the balance between people presenting the workshops is pretty much 50-50. But sometimes I think there's also a question about confidence and about who the people are who go out publicly and represent that group in terms of speaking to the council. And quite often in groups that I visit, I see that it tends to be the men who either, depending on how you look at it, who either step forward or get pushed forward or push themselves forward to be that spokesperson. And so I think there's a lot of work to be done in terms of giving everybody the confidence to feel that they can kind of go out and stand up and speak for that group. But certainly my experience on the ground is that actually the balance of people who are involved is very good, really.
Thank you. Thank you, Rob. I think we have time for a couple more questions, and thank you, Kathy, for that question. Russell Evans, go ahead if you can unmute yourself.
Yeah, can you guys hear me?
Yes.
All right. I'm glad that Kathy asked that question, because one of the things that I'm finding in my own transition initiative is how before I used to think that transition was about skillfully going about doing things like setting up complementary currencies. But now I feel like our psychologist is the most important member of our group in the sense that when people are trying to do things, which is to literally transition the entire economy as we know it, it's really challenging, and it requires a lot of courage, and it requires a lot of personal growth to accompany that. And I was talking with Isabel, who's doing an educational program over in England, and she was saying the same thing, where with the transition education initiatives they have, having that kind of emotional mentor was this key component that people hadn't necessarily imagined. And so I'm wondering if you've also noticed that kind of in the bigger scope, because you probably have a better sense of transition in general than any of us do.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I mean, that's absolutely the experience here, I think, is that actually if the group just plows on thinking, right, we need to do stuff, let's create a local currency, let's create an energy company, let's start a farm or whatever, and isn't paying attention to the emotional side of it, then there's a lot of potential there for burnout and for the whole thing just falling to pieces. Obviously, there's a balance, that also if you just sat around thinking about those things and never did anything, then that would be a bit of a waste of time too. So it's really about that balance. But I think it's one of the things that really distinguishes transition actually from a lot of other approaches is that paying attention to that, is that inner transition side of things. And certainly any of those of you who are listening who've done the transition training will know that it's, a good bit of the course is about that, and it's about good listening skills and personal resilience and taking care of yourself. And as I said at the beginning, I think for me being involved in transition, that aspect of having people who offer that support and that mentoring has made an enormous difference in terms of burnout and in terms of people feeling really supported. So so I think that's a really good sort of observation that you've had, in your group about the value of that and the power of that, because I think that's one of the things that is all too often ignored in community change processes. And if we can look after each other and look after each other's personal resilience, that'll make a big difference to our effectiveness.
Oh, wonderful, Rob. Thanks for that. Trish Knox.
Yes, hi Carolyn, hi Rob. I'm wanting to talk about our journey in resilience, and I'm finding that in my brain there's some new energy, some new creativity, some new inspiration, and I'm thinking if this is true for me, it's probably true for many of us, and even the global brain of our planet is being ignited and enlivened. So Rob, could you talk about transition nurturing a new intelligence personally and collectively?
Yeah, well, I think it's I love the way that what's it called? Paul Hawkins talks about the Earth's immune system kicking in. And I think transition is just one of many, many things that are happening at this time that is starting to drive this process forward. And it's all too easy to focus on the bad news and on the bad things that are happening. But actually, what transition's doing, I think, and one of the things is really starting to create this sort of learning network globally. That idea of transition being an experiment and people doing what they do and sharing what comes out of it is really exciting to see that starting to spread. I mean, the internet sort of has enabled that in a way that wasn't really the case before. And I don't know, it does feel like there is something much bigger happening in terms of when all this stuff joins up together. I don't know whether I use the term the global brain, but it does feel to me like actually what we're creating is a very effective global learning network of people sharing that expertise, and it does feel to me like that immune system is starting to kick in.
Wonderful. Good news. David Wemberly, you might be the last question here.
Thank you. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Fantastic. Rob, I'm glad to hear that you're putting out a new edition of the Transition Primer. Just last night I gave a short talk on the nuts and bolts of how to start a transition group, and I found that the published material is too rich for an introduction, and I've had to simplify and simplify and simplify, and I hope that's part of what you're going to be doing there, and that it includes also perhaps a sample PowerPoint that someone can look into, and so that they can give that sort of presentation pretty easily. But that's not why I wanted to ask the question. I'm delighted with the attention at this call about inner transition and the transition of the mindset of the entire planet. I've been looking at somewhere in between a lot recently, and that is the fact that the organizations that we are a part of take on their own identity and their own set of good and bad habits and their own expectations. And we have, in most cultures, we've lost the connection to the uplifted inner quality when we are in meetings as a corporate body. And I'm interested in how to bring inner transition into the inner transition of the way that the corporate bodies think and operate, and including ways of starting and ending meetings that won't be a prayer, but so much as a way of bringing us back to our inner selves, our inner aspirations, looking at the inner story that we're bringing forward and seeing how we can operate in ways that lift us up rather than just going in there to get the job done or make the money or get done with the agenda. And any information you might have on that, connections, people to talk to, and also thoughts on it, I'd sure appreciate.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I suppose a lot of those tools around running good meetings and leaving time at the end of the meeting to reflect on the meeting itself and how it was facilitated would be very useful. The ways of sort of developing good agendas and creating space for people to sort of talk about what's current with them and having go-rounds and that kind of stuff. I mean, there's lots of tools, I think, that are used in transition and in other meetings in that way that would really, that being used in that more corporate setting, people would find really, really effective and really useful. I mean, maybe that's one of the next things that we need is a kind of a primer of transition activities that could be useful in that kind of a setting. That could be really interesting, I think. But yeah, I mean, it's interesting what you said about how it feels like the materials can be a bit complex, and that's certainly, when we did the transition handbook had the 12 steps as the model, and then it felt like after a while what people were doing was actually more complex than that. It wasn't that people started out doing 12 steps, and when we went to people and said, which of these steps are you doing, they would say, well, we did the first one, and then we did the 5th one, and then we did the 11th one, and we didn't like the other one, so then we did something else. So it was interesting then to find out, well, what actually are people doing? And that's what led into seeing transition as a set of ingredients that people assemble in different ways, in different settings. And that was what underlined the transition companion. But then that meant that actually the transition companion is a sort of a big, quite dense kind of all singing, all dancing, the equivalent of one of those hardback books that tells you in complete detail how every aspect of your car works, whereas what we didn't then have was a book that was a kind of why driving is really, really exciting and fantastic and everybody should do it kind of a book, which is hopefully what the power of just doing stuff will be. So hopefully that kind of accessible resource that you were saying you don't find, and you have to simplify the material. Hopefully that's what we'll be producing over the next few months.
Thank you, Rob. I wanted to mention that Transition US is working with a few trainers to put together what you were requesting, David, was just sort of a simple slide deck with talking points. We'll be calling it Transition Talk Training. And I know there's been something similar in the UK. This will be our version. So look for that in the coming months. And we also have Nick Osborne from the Transition Network, who's a trainer and has developed a course called Effective Groups. And he'll be coming across the nation doing 3 different trainings in mid-September. So there'll be news about that as well. Rob, I wanted to give you just an opportunity for any closing thoughts or comments you might have, and then we'll all be saying our fond farewell and thank you to you.
Not really, just to thank everybody for making this time to come along and listen to this, and to say, I kind of feel like when I was talking, I was mostly talking about projects in the UK because that's sort of where most of my experience is, but I'm also aware that there's many, many, many thousands of you doing some fantastic stuff in your places across the US, and to really honour that and salute that, and that's fantastic. And we really love to get those stories, and increasingly what my role is in Transition Network is that sort of storytelling, telling the stories of what people are doing. So do share with us the stories of what's happening on the ground where you are, because I think that's what really brings all of this to life and inspires other people. And to thank Transition US for facilitating this, and all the great work they do too. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And Rob, I hope we'll do this again sometime a little sooner than the last time we had you on. So it would be wonderful to get some new updates about your work and transition in many other countries.